I never expected a quiet stretch of creek behind my property to become the thing that brought down an entire homeowners association. But looking back now, I can honestly say the warning signs were there from the very beginning. The funny thing is, none of this started with lawsuits, police reports, or neighborhood drama. It started with a simple assumption made by people who had spent so long getting their way that they genuinely forgot what the word no sounded like. A few years ago, I owned a piece of land outside a town I'll call Willow Creek. Nothing fancy. No mansion, no private gate, no luxury ranch. Just a comfortable home sitting on acreage that had been in private hands long before developers started showing up and carving the countryside into neat little subdivisions with stone entrance signs and inspirational slogans. Running through the back portion of my land was a narrow creek. During the spring it flowed fast enough for fishing. During dry months you could almost walk across it without getting your knees wet. It wasn't some majestic river out of a postcard, but it was peaceful, and more importantly, it was mine. The deed was crystal clear. I owned both banks and the creek bed itself across the entire section that crossed my property. I never thought much about that detail until the subdivision next door was built. The developer bought hundreds of acres around me, divided everything into housing lots, built attractive entrances, installed decorative fencing, and marketed the place as an upscale nature community. Apparently, one of their favorite selling points was something they called exclusive creekside living. That phrase would become very important later. At first, I didn't pay attention. People moved in. Houses went up. Life continued. Then one afternoon, I found a newsletter sitting in my mailbox addressed to residents of Cedar Ridge Estates. The problem was I didn't live in Cedar Ridge Estates. I tossed it in the trash and forgot about it. A few weeks later, I received a due statement. Then another. Then someone from the HOA management company knocked on my door with a bright smile and a clipboard. She introduced herself and asked for my contact information so they could update the community directory. I remember smiling back and saying, "I think you've got the wrong house." She laughed. "No, you're one of the remaining properties inside the community footprint." I said, "Actually, I'm not part of your community." Her smile twitched a little. "Well, technically you're surrounded by it. Still not part of it." For a second, she just stared at me. Then she recovered and said something that stuck in my head. She told me the board would love to discuss bringing my parcel into alignment with community standards. Bringing my parcel into alignment. It sounded less like a conversation and more like a threat disguised as customer service. A few days later, one of the board members came by in a golf cart. He tried a different angle. According to him, I benefited from roads maintained by the association. I pointed out that the road section nearest me sat inside a county easement and was public access. He frowned and said, "That's your interpretation." I actually laughed out loud. Public records aren't interpretations. They're records. After that came invitations to neighborhood events with handwritten notes encouraging me to discuss membership opportunities. Then came warnings. Suddenly violation notices started appearing on my gate. One claimed I had an unauthorized utility trailer visible from neighboring lots. Another claimed my fire pit violated community safety regulations. Another cited guest parking restrictions. Every single notice assumed I belonged to the HOA. Finally, I called the management company. I wanted to believe there had been some clerical mistake. Maybe someone entered the wrong parcel number into a database somewhere. But the woman on the phone wasn't confused at all. She calmly explained that because my property bordered the subdivision, the board believed it had authority over certain conditions affecting the community. I remember sitting there in silence for a moment, wondering if she actually believed what she was saying. Then I told her very clearly that no homeowners association has authority over property that isn't subject to its covenants. She replied, "That's not how the board sees it." And right there, something shifted in my mind. Up until that point, I thought I was dealing with incompetence. After that phone call, I realized I was dealing with something worse. I sent them copies of my deed. I sent survey maps. I highlighted the legal descriptions showing my parcel had been excluded before the subdivision was ever created. Weeks passed. Nothing changed. If anything, they became more aggressive. Then one Saturday morning, while I was checking a water pump near the creek, I saw a black SUV slowly rolling along the fence line. The vehicle had decals that read Community Patrol Unit. Two men stepped out wearing matching dark polo shirts with metal badges clipped to their belts. At first glance, they looked almost official. Then you looked closer and realized they were basically mall security dressed up for Halloween. One of them walked over and asked if I was the property owner. I said yes. He nodded seriously and informed me that residents had reported unauthorized activity near the creek. Unauthorized activity. On my own property. When I asked who made that determination, he said the homeowners association. Then he informed me that overnight camping and open fires near the water were prohibited by community regulations. I stared at him for a moment before pointing toward the survey marker sitting 20 feet away. Do you see that stake? I asked. He looked confused. Yeah. Everything on this side belongs to me. He shifted uncomfortably. That's a civil matter. I smiled and said, then here's my civil response. Get off my property. The look on his face was priceless. He clearly wasn't used to people refusing to play along with the little authority fantasy they were selling. He eventually left, but as I watched that SUV disappear down the trail, I had a feeling the situation wasn't over. In fact, I was beginning to suspect the real trouble hadn't even started yet. The person who really turned this whole situation into a war was the HOA president, a woman I'll call Linda Mercer. Everybody in the neighborhood knew Linda. She had one of those polished, confident voices that made every sentence sound like it had already been approved by a committee. The problem was she wasn't just running an HOA anymore. Somewhere along the line, she'd started acting like she was governing a small country. The first time she came to my property, I was splitting firewood near the barn. She walked over carrying a folder under her arm and smiled the way politicians smile when they're about to tell you something you don't want to hear. We need to resolve your creek issue, she said. I remember lowering the log splitter and staring at her. My creek issue, she nodded. Residents have concerns regarding liability exposure and unauthorized use of community waterfront areas. I almost laughed. Community waterfront areas. She was standing on land that had been privately owned longer than she'd probably been alive. I asked her if by unauthorized use she meant me fishing on my own property. Her expression tightened. And camping. The way she said it, you'd think I was operating an illegal casino in the woods. The truth was simple. Every few months I'd carry a folding chair, a small tent, and a cooler down to a gravel bar beside the creek. I'd sit there, listen to the water, maybe catch a few fish, maybe not. It was peaceful. Apparently peace offended the HOA. Linda opened her folder and handed me a document. It was an official board resolution. According to the paper, overnight occupancy near the creek was prohibited. Campfires were prohibited. Recreational access was restricted. I looked at the document, then looked at her. You understand you can't vote new rules on somebody else's land, right? She smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind of smile people use when they're convinced they'll eventually wear you down. When activities affect the community, the board has authority. No, it doesn't. We can issue fines. No, you can't. We can suspend access. That one made me laugh so hard I nearly dropped the paperwork. Suspend access from what? I asked. My own property. Her face immediately darkened. That was the moment I realized something important. This wasn't about rules. This wasn't about safety. This wasn't even about property. It was about control. Linda had spent years being the most powerful person inside Cedar Ridge Estates. Everyone else followed the rules because they had to. I was the one person she couldn't control. And that bothered her more than she wanted to admit. Over the following weeks, something strange started happening. Residents began approaching me with questions. One guy stopped me while I was checking my mailbox and asked if he needed my permission to fish near the creek. Another asked whether I had sold access rights to the HOA. A retired teacher named Nancy actually brought me one of the HOA newsletters. That's when everything changed. Buried inside the budget section were line items called Creek Stewardship Assessment, Waterfront Safety Program, Environmental Access Maintenance, and Community Patrol Operations. At first I thought I was misunderstanding something. Then I looked closer. The HOA was collecting money from residents to maintain and patrol property it didn't own. I sat at my kitchen table that night reading the documents 3 times. The more I read, the worse it looked. The association was presenting the creek as a community amenity. Their newsletters implied they controlled it. Their maps showed it as part of the neighborhood identity. Homeowners were paying fees based on that assumption. Meanwhile, the actual ownership records told a completely different story. That's when the whole thing stopped being annoying and started becoming serious. Over the next several weekends, I dug through county records. Survey maps, easement filings, development plans, insurance documents, old parcel records. The paper trail was incredibly clear. My property had been carved out years before the subdivision restrictions existed. The HOA owned the decorative entrance area, a drainage basin, and a narrow walking path near the front of the development. That was basically it. They didn't own the creek. They didn't own my riverbank. They didn't own my campsite. They didn't own anything near the section they kept advertising. I decided to give them one final opportunity to back down. I sent a detailed email to the management company. I attached supporting documents. I explained the ownership boundaries. I requested they stop issuing notices, stop entering my property, stop representing my land as a community asset, and stop collecting fees associated with property they didn't control. Their response arrived 2 days later. One sentence. The board disagrees with your interpretation. That was it. No legal citation. No evidence. No explanation. Just arrogance wrapped in a complete sentence. Sitting there reading that email, I remember thinking something my grandfather used to say. Give people enough rope and eventually they'll tie their own knot. So I made a decision. I was going camping. Not because I needed a camping trip. Not because I wanted a confrontation. I wanted proof. I wanted witnesses. I wanted them to make the mistake I suspected they were already preparing to make. The following weekend I loaded my truck with a tent, a cooler, a folding chair, fishing gear, and enough supplies to spend a comfortable night by the creek. I carried everything down to the gravel bar and set up camp in plain sight. No hiding. No games. No ambiguity. By sunrise the next morning, I was sitting beside a small contained fire drinking coffee when I heard footsteps coming through the brush. One of the HOA patrol guys appeared carrying a radio like he was preparing for a tactical operation. You were warned, he announced. I took another sip of coffee. Was on. No overnight camping. No fires. Pack it up. I smiled. No. The guy actually looked stunned. Then he started taking pictures with his phone. This will be documented as non-compliance. Try to get my good side, I said. 20 minutes later Linda arrived. So did a representative from the management company. Linda marched toward my campsite like a general approaching enemy territory. You're banned from this area, she announced before even saying hello. I looked around dramatically. That's strange. I don't remember banning myself. Her jaw clenched. The management representative stepped forward with that fake professional tone people use when they think paperwork gives them magical powers. She informed me that the association had determined my activities created safety risks and public nuisances. If I refused to leave voluntarily, they would escalate enforcement. I asked the obvious question. Escalate to what? Before she could answer, the patrol guy spoke up. Trespassing enforcement. The second he said those words, I knew they'd learned absolutely nothing. In fact, they had somehow become even more confident in their own fiction. Please do, I said. Linda smiled. She genuinely thought she was winning. She told the patrol officer to contact the sheriff's department, and less than an hour later 2 deputies arrived. What happened next would end up changing everything, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. Because for the first time, someone outside the HOA bubble was about to examine the facts. And facts have a nasty habit of surviving long after authority figures run out of excuses. Part 3. The deputies listened patiently, while Linda launched into what was obviously a speech she'd been rehearsing in her head for weeks. According to her, I was violating community rules, occupying restricted property, creating fire hazards, ignoring official warnings, and refusing lawful orders from association representatives. She talked fast, confidently, and loudly enough that everyone standing near the creek could hear every word. One of the deputies finally raised a hand and asked a simple question. Do you own this property? Linda immediately pointed toward the folder her management representative was carrying. That's when they started handing over maps, resolutions, violation notices, and internal documents. It looked impressive at first glance. Lots of official-looking paperwork. Lots of highlighted sections. Lots of signatures. Then the deputy turned toward me and asked if I had ownership records. I reached into my backpack and handed him copies of the deed, survey maps, parcel records, and county filings I'd brought specifically because I knew this day was coming. For several minutes nobody spoke. The deputy simply stood there comparing documents. The silence became uncomfortable. Then Linda made the mistake that destroyed everything. She looked toward one of the patrol officers and said, Go ahead and start clearing the campsite. He's had enough chances. The deputy's head snapped up immediately. Nobody touches anything, he said sharply. The patrol guy froze mid-step. The The second deputy looked directly at Linda. Ma'am, if this property belongs to him and someone removes his belongings, you're creating a completely different problem. Most people would have backed off right there. Most people would have realized the situation wasn't going the way they expected. Linda wasn't most people. She doubled down. She started insisting the creek corridor belonged to the association. The deputy asked for the parcel number associated with the claimed ownership. Linda didn't know it. The management representative started flipping through papers. Then something caught the deputy's attention. He pointed at one of their maps and frowned. I leaned over slightly and saw it too. On the HOA's internal documents, my property had been relabeled as Community Waterfront Tract. Not adjacent property, not neighboring parcel. Community Waterfront Tract. They hadn't proven ownership. They had simply renamed somebody else's land and started acting like that made it theirs. The deputy looked from their map to my survey and then back again. Finally, he asked the question that changed everything. Why are you enforcing rules on property you don't own? Nobody had a good answer. The management representative tried talking about safety authority. The deputy immediately shut that down. Private associations don't have public safety authority. Linda pointed angrily toward my fire ring and demanded to know whether property owners could simply do whatever they wanted. The deputy looked at her and said, within the law and on their own property, generally yes. For the first time since I'd met her, Linda looked genuinely shocked. Not embarrassed. Not frustrated. Shocked. Like reality itself had betrayed her. Before leaving, the deputies advised everyone associated with the HOA to stay off my property and documented the entire encounter. One of them quietly asked if I wanted an incident report created regarding the threats to remove my belongings. I said yes. As the patrol vehicle and HOA cart disappeared up the trail, I sat back down in my folding chair and stared at the water. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I mostly felt tired. But deep down, I also knew something else. People who spend years building authority on false assumptions rarely stop after a single defeat. They either learn from the experience or they escalate. Linda chose escalation. Within days, the HOA sent a community-wide email accusing an unnamed neighboring landowner of spreading misinformation and attempting to undermine neighborhood unity. Residents forwarded the message to me almost immediately. Then someone placed an authorized community access only sign beside one of the trails crossing my property. I took photographs and removed it. Then homeowners started asking questions. Lots of questions. Why was the HOA collecting creek maintenance fees? Why weren't those ownership claims disclosed during home purchases? Why were residents funding patrol services for land the association didn't control? Why had the board spent years representing private property as a community amenity? The more questions people asked, the uglier the answers became. Homeowners began sharing documents, budgets, contracts, meeting notes, internal communications. Soon another discovery surfaced. The company providing the so-called patrol officers was owned by Linda's brother-in-law. Then someone found insurance records describing the creek corridor as an association-controlled common area. Then residents noticed budget allocations tied to maintenance projects performed on property the HOA didn't own. The situation snowballed faster than anyone expected. The management company quietly announced it was terminating its contract. Homeowners demanded audits. Special meetings were scheduled. Attorneys were hired. Independent accountants reviewed years of records. Meanwhile, Linda came to my house one final time. She stood on my porch looking exhausted, angry, and somehow still convinced she could negotiate from a position of strength. She told me things had gone too far. I agreed. She suggested resolving matters privately. I laughed. She accused me of turning residents against the board. I told her the truth. I didn't turn anyone against them. I just showed them the paperwork. She asked me to stop communicating with homeowners. I asked her if she finally understood that none of this would have happened if she'd simply left my property alone. She didn't answer. She just left. A few weeks later, the residents held a special meeting. I wasn't there because I wasn't a member, but friends inside kept texting updates throughout the meeting. One board member resigned, then another. Eventually, the entire board was recalled. The patrol contract was canceled. Independent reviews confirmed years of unauthorized enforcement actions, misleading representations, improper fee collections, and significant financial exposure. But the most surprising thing happened afterward. Once residents realized the creek had never belonged to the HOA, they started questioning the entire purpose of the organization. Without the illusion of exclusive waterfront access, there wasn't much left besides entrance landscaping, minor maintenance responsibilities, and endless rules. Over the following months, discussions shifted from reform to dissolution. Eventually, the homeowners voted to wind the association down completely. No more board. No more management company. No more fake patrol officers. No more threatening letters over things they didn't control. And me? I got exactly what I'd wanted from the beginning. Peace. Some evenings I still carry a folding chair down to that same gravel bar beside the creek. Sometimes I fish. Sometimes I just sit there listening to the water. Every now and then I think about how easily all of it could have been avoided. One simple decision. One moment where somebody could have accepted a boundary and walked away. Instead, they built an entire empire around control, and the moment someone challenged the foundation, the whole thing collapsed. Now here's what I'd love to know from you. Was I right to keep pushing after the deputies proved I owned the land? Or should I have stopped there and let the HOA continue operating however it wanted? Did the board destroy itself? Or did I play a bigger role than I like to admit? Let me know in the comments, because this is one of those stories where people seem to have very different opinions, and honestly, I can understand both sides of the argument.